The clock in the hall struck midnight, slow and heavy, like a warning from the earth itself. Thorn-field was quiet for a breath. Then the quiet cracked. Smoke crept first. It crawled along the baseboards and whispered beneath the doors. It reached the rugs and the drapes and the old wooden stairs that had carried so many years on their backs. In the kitchen, a small flame lifted its head and found grease. The flame smiled, then climbed. On the second floor, the master dreamed with a glass of brandy on the table. His wife turned on her pillow and thought of nothing at all. Their grown sons slept the thick sleep of men who believe the world will always bend for them. Their daughter kept a small journal under her bed where she wrote in a careful hand about a life she had never had to earn. The first cough came from behind a locked door down the corridor. The second cough was louder. Then someone woke and tried the handle and found it hot. A bell rope waited beside the bed, but the bell was gone. The rope swung in the dark, useless as a prayer spoken after the last breath. The servants' staircase, narrow, dry, mean as a throat, took the fire like it had been waiting years to be chosen. Smoke turned the hallways into blind tunnels. Glass sweated. Paint bubbled. The house began to speak in pops and cracks and sighs. It sounded like a body remembering every injury at once. In the yard, a man stood with his hands at his sides. He did not move toward the flames. He did not call out. He watched his breath pale and vanish in the cold. He had the stillness of a carved figure on a grave. This was Samuel. He tasted smoke on the air the way a hunter tastes iron before the storm. He saw orange touch the second-floor curtains and pull them inward like a breath. He watched the light flicker across brick and frost and the faces of the other enslaved people who had gathered, half-dressed, half-believing. The overseer shouted for water. Buckets ran in trembling hands. Water met fire and turned to steam with a hiss that meant nothing to the blaze. A window on the eastern bedroom brightened until it was no longer a window but a mouth. Behind the glass, a shape moved fast and then faster, hands on a latch that would not give. A fish struck wood, struck again. The house did not care. It had been drying for 50 years. Tonight it was ready to burn. Samuel listened for a single sound, a sound only he knew to expect. The small roar that means the stairwell is gone and there is no path left downward. When he heard it, when the servants' stairs went from wood to torch, he closed his eyes. Not to pray. To fix the moment in his mind so he would carry it with him wherever he was taken next, be it prison, a rope, or a ditch with no name. Someone screamed his name across the yard. He did not answer. The scream bent away from him and rushed toward the house like everything else did. The air, the heat, the awful pull of what cannot be undone. On the roof line, sparks lifted into the night, hung for a heartbeat, then scattered into the dark like 1,000 tiny decisions finally made. The house had been the master of this land. Tonight the fire was master. It ate like famine. It taught like grief. It judged like winter. A young boy at Samuel's side asked if the family would come out. Samuel's lips moved, but the words that belonged to mercy did not come. No, he said at last. Not tonight. The clock inside had melted to silence. The walls sagged and gave. The flames pulled the shape of the house inward, and the old brick bowed like a tired back. The night took everything else. And still Samuel stood, as if his feet were nailed to the earth and the earth was tired of letting nails rust. The wind turned. The smoke slid over the gathered crowd and made them cough and tear. The overseer cursed. The buckets kept moving. The flames laughed at the buckets. Somewhere inside, a mirror shattered. Somewhere deeper, a timber let go with a moan. Samuel breathed once, slowly. The reckoning had come. And the reckoning wore fire. Morning at Thorn-field was always pretty from far away. Fog hugged the fields and the river moved like polished metal. Birds sang because birds have never owed anybody a debt. The big house sat grand against the trees, brick glowing when the sun found it. If you did not know better, you might have called it peace. Up close the ground told the truth. Footprints in dust where men had run when the whip sang. A patch of earth packed flat by years of buying and selling. A small, rough grave where a mother had placed the last flower she could find. The perfume of magnolia never reached the quarters. Smoke and boiled greens and sweat told their own story. At Thorn-field, every day was a list that began before dawn. Milk the cows. Stoke the kitchen stove. Haul water until shoulders went numb. Weed tobacco rose until the sun squeezed the world white. Carry trays into rooms where people smiled with small mouths and thanked God for the harvest brought by other people's hands. Words had rules. Eyes had rules. Steps had rules. You learned them by living or by bleeding. You learned to be smaller than your shadow. You learned to count heartbeats between your thoughts and your tongue. The master, Edmund Haraway, was a man who liked to hear himself called fair. He read scripture after supper and folded his hands like a picture in a book. He believed order came from God and that his place in that order was proof enough of his goodness. He did not ask the field hands what they thought of God. His wife kept a ledger the way a priest keeps a Bible. Numbers for flour, for cloth, for tools, for people. She tracked ages, heights, and prices with clean ink. When she slept, her right hand curled like it still held a pen. Their sons learned to ride and to shoot. Their daughter learned the way a lady's smile holds back every sharp thought. They drifted through rooms where everything belonged to them, even the air. James Fletcher, the overseer, wore his hat low and his patience lower. He believed in speed and pain. He believed men were mules until proven otherwise. Under him, days were thinner, nights slower, and Sunday felt like a lie. The enslaved made life where they could. They mended broken spoons and broken hearts. They turned the smallest corner of the smallest hour into a place where a song could live. A mother taught a child to hum so the child would not forget her voice if the auction bell took him. On some mornings, if the fog was thick, you could not see the house from the quarters. That was the only kind of freedom that ever came without a price, the kind delivered by weather. Thorn-field looked gentle from the road. It held men like a fist. Samuel came into the world on a hard bed in a hot room. His mother, Denina, breathed like a saw cutting through green wood. The midwife wiped her brow with the edge of her apron and whispered the old prayers that had crossed an ocean in someone's ribs. By sunrise the baby cried. By noon the room was still, and the midwife covered the mother's face. People said Samuel had his mother's eyes, clear and surprised, like he was always finding the world new. His father, Job, held him like the last egg of spring. Job worked in the barns and had a gift for animals and a trouble for letters. He picked up scraps of newsprint and followed the lines with a finger the same way he followed tracks in mud. He taught himself the shapes of names because names are a kind of power. The day the master learned Job could read, the master learned he could sell. The traders came on a Tuesday with a careful handshake and small eyes. Job kissed his son's forehead and said one sentence Samuel would never forget. Remember, what you know is yours even when they take everything else. The wagon carried Job down the road until the dust swallowed the wheels. The quarters learned not to say his name in the open. Samuel grew tall before he grew old. He learned to carry 2 buckets and to carry silence. He learned that a man can starve for 2 things at once, food and respect. He learned to hide his mind the way you hide fire in greenwood. He met Celia beside the stream where the quarters beat laundry against smooth stones. She had the kind of steady that turned a rough day into a livable one. Her laughter was soft and rare and worth waiting for. When the night was kind, they sat near the door and watched the dark and said nothing. Their hands found each other without asking. Celia could turn cornmeal and a bone into supper and make the children think the world was larger than it was. She hummed the slow songs that stitched an old grief into something that would not break when you touched it. She never spoke about escape. She spoke about tomorrow like a promise she had made to herself and meant to keep. They had 3 children. Moses first, sharp-eyed, careful with questions until he wasn't. Ruth with a stubborn chin and quick fingers. Jacob, small and fierce, who liked to sleep with his face pressed into the crook of Samuel's arm. At night, Samuel carved little toys from the ends of wood he found on the path and left them on the children's pillows like luck. He told them stories in the old rhythm that made the walls feel farther apart. He taught Moses the first letters in the dust at the back of the cabin, then wiped them away with his heel before the moon could read them. Some days Samuel thought he could make a life inside a cage if the cage held the people he loved. He fixed the door latch, patched the roof, and added a small shelf for a small Bible that had once been his mother's. The shelf stayed straight even when the wind blew wrong. Years stacked like split logs. Samuel carried years the way he carried water, one step at a time, eyes down, mouth closed. He told himself a simple vow: my children will know love even here. But love cannot stop a ledger. It can only teach you how to look someone in the eye when the numbers arrive. The strangers wore coats too fine for dust and boots too clean for honest work. They shook the overseer's hand like men who never had to use a hand for anything else. Their wagon carried chains wrapped in burlap so the sun would not glint on the iron. Samuel saw them from the yard behind the kitchen and felt something inside him lean away. Traders were weather with teeth. They came in pairs and left with names that used to belong to families. Aunt Bess, who ran the kitchen like a general and a saint, kept her ear open and her hands moving. When she had a scrap of news, she passed it like bread. She caught Samuel's sleeve by the pump and spoke without looking at him. "Debts," she said. "Tobacco was thin last year. He's looking to balance his page." Samuel's grip tightened on the handle. "Whose name?" She did not answer. She had not been given mercy enough to offer false hope. By noon the quarters knew three things: a sale was coming, it would be soon, and the men in clean boots were pleased with what they had found. The only question left was whose grief would rip first. In the kitchen, Jenny, the mistress's maid, kept her voice low while she ironed collars. "I heard them say, 'The boy that reads.' They like to sell, smart, to Mississippi. They like the price it fetches." She swallowed and ran the iron over the linen as if she could press the world flat. "They said Moses." The name fell between them like a pan dropped from a height. Samuel kept his hands still. He made his face into wood. He thanked Jenny with a nod he could barely manage. On the edge of the vegetable patch, Moses crouched with a small spade, turning soil like it could answer a question. He looked up as his father's shadow crossed the row. The boy's eyes were too old for his face. "It's time, isn't it?" he asked. Samuel had rehearsed other words. Only the truth came. "Yes." They stood there for a long minute, the plant leaves trembling in a wind that wasn't there. Samuel put his hands on his son's shoulders. "You are not a thing," he said softly. "Not in your mind, not in your bones. No matter where they send your body, that truth walks with you." Moses nodded and looked down so the ground would not see him cry. When he looked up again, a line had settled in his jaw that Samuel recognized from the mirror he never had. Celia packed a cloth bundle with steady fingers that betrayed nothing until the second she tied the knot. Then the knot broke in her hands and she had to sit. Ruth fetched water. Jacob climbed into his mother's lap and asked why people with fine boots wanted his brother. "Because they don't know what love is," Celia whispered. "Or they do and they don't care." The overseer came with iron in his hands and spoke to Moses like he was giving him a chore to finish before supper. The cuffs closed with a sound that made the hair stand up on Samuel's arms. He remembered that sound from a day with dust and a disappearing wagon. The walk to the front drive was a kind of funeral where every mourner walked himself. The other enslaved watched from the fields and the porches with faces too careful to be called faces. The traders smiled like men who had at last solved a puzzle. The master stepped down from the porch and the sun touched his ring. "Strong boy," he said to the men who counted. "Reads like a clerk. Quick with figures. Good temper." He spoke like he was proud. He spoke like any of that gentleness had come from him. The coins clinked. The leather pouch grew lighter of air and heavier of sin. The traders wrote a name in a book that did not belong to them and tipped their hats. Moses climbed into the wagon by himself because he had learned the first rule of dignity: take what choice you can even when the world is small. He looked back once. His mother's hands were at her mouth. His sister's hands were fists. His father's hands were empty. The wagon started. The road curved. The dust rose. Samuel stared at the bend long after it looked like nothing at all. He did not move. He did not blink. When the dust settled, he closed his eyes and found a place inside him where nothing lived anymore. The sun kept going. The day did not care what it had done. The house still needed water. The cows still needed milking. The fields still swallowed sweat. Grief did not stop chores. It only made each movement feel like pushing a wheel uphill with your teeth. Celia moved as if her bones had lost a small piece of their shape. She kept Moses' sleeping roll folded at the foot of the bed and smoothed it every evening until the cloth shone. She sang less. When she did sing, the notes sounded like they came from far away, as if she were borrowing them from another woman who had not yet known the word auction. Ruth grew quiet and older. She stitched her mother's hem with a needle that shook in her fingers. At night she asked when Moses might come back and then bit her lip as if she knew the answer hurt more when said aloud. Jacob saved a bite of meal each supper and set it in a little tin against the wall. He wanted his brother to have food if he found his way home in the dark. Every morning Celia threw the old bite to the chickens and did not explain, because there are some lessons a mother cannot teach without breaking herself open. Samuel's hands did their work. His mind did something else. During the day the mind waited. At night it walked. It traced hallways and doors and windows. It measured floorboards by the length of a man's stride. It listened to the house breathe and found its weak rib. He told himself he was only thinking. He told himself thinking had never been a crime unless you said it out loud. He told himself a man must be allowed the simple work of running his thoughts to ground so they would not run him. One evening as the sun cut the world into gold and shadow, Samuel stood near the back steps of the big house and watched the smoke from the kitchen drift toward the trees. He felt a stillness settle over him, the way a pond settles after a stone sinks. It was not peace. It was decision. He looked up at the windows that had reflected his face for 3 decades and thought, I have given my hands to this place. It has taken everything else. The price must be paid back. The thought did not feel like anger. It felt like arithmetic. He slept that night beside his family and kept his breathing even so they would not wake and ask questions he could not answer without changing them forever. In the dark, under the roof he had patched with his own hands, he planned. He planned until the roosters began to argue about the morning. When he finally slept, he dreamed a single bright dream in which the ledger in the mistress's hand caught a spark and crumbled to black lace. He woke with his heart calm and his jaw set. That day the sun climbed the same sky as always. But Samuel walked through it as a different man. Revenge that works must be quiet until it sings. Samuel knew this as well as he knew the weight of a full bucket. He began with the bell ropes. In each bedroom, a tassel hung that would ring a bell in the hall when pulled. Samuel told the mistress the ropes had frayed. He took them down with respectful hands. He promised to mend them. He set them aside and never brought them back. He studied windows. Some were stubborn, some were too kind. Where the latch turned smooth, he turned it tighter. Where a sash slid easy, he rubbed a little grease along the track and then dusted it with fine ash so it would bite. Nothing that would fail in daylight. Something that would stall in heat and panic. He cleaned the servants' stairs and learned every sound they made. He listened for the boards that cried out even under the softest foot and the ones that held their tongues until a man trusted them. He found the place where the risers met the stringer like dry lips. He imagined flame kissing that seam and smiling. He gathered rags as if he feared the coming winter. He soaked them in lamp oil in the shed behind the smokehouse and wrung them out so they did not drip. He folded them small and slid them behind sideboards, beneath kindling baskets, and into the mouth of the stairwell where dust lived like tinder that had been praying. He moved grease from the kitchen, in cups and jars that meant nothing by themselves, and placed it where a spill would mean a river. A small line along a baseboard here. A saucer under a table leg there. He wiped every drop with a clean cloth, then wiped the cloth again, then burned the cloth in the yard stove with the peelings. He loosened a hinge on a door that opened to a cold back step. In the day it looked normal. In the night it would stick just enough to make a hand fumble for the second try. He kept his face plain. He let the overseer believe the set of his shoulders meant surrender and not secrecy. He laughed once in the kitchen at a small joke about molasses so the cook would remember he did not always carry a storm. He waited for weather. He watched the almanac with the eye of a sailor. He thought about wind, the way it leans into roofs and lays smoke along the floor. He thought about how fast a house can wake and how slow a sleeping mind can be when the air goes bad. He needed a night when the family would be heavy with food and wine and a kind of pride. A night when the house slaves would be dismissed early to rest before a busy morning. A night when carriages would carry the neighbor's eyes away before the first bead of sweat formed on the master's brow. The chance came like a door left unlatched. A dinner was planned for men who spoke of prices and pounds and acres, who held cigars like torches and opinions like chains. The mistress set out silver that had never been paid for by her hands. The sons wore coats dark as the inside of a well. The daughter practiced a smile in a small hand mirror and then let it fall. Samuel moved through the dinner service the way a river moves, quiet, constant, pulling everything toward a mouth only it understands. He filled glasses. He refolded napkins. He left small things in small places where only the night would find them. When the last horse left the drive and the last laugh faded into the trees, the house sank into that deep, careless quiet the rich believe they are owed. Samuel asked to stay and tidy. The overseer, flattered by a diligence he thought he owned, waved his hand. The midnight hour approached with soft feet and a hard face. Samuel checked the stairwell and felt its breath. He opened the kitchen door and tasted the draw of the chimney. He listened to the house talk to itself, old wood making old sounds. He laid the first rag at the lowest step and touched it with a coal held in tongs. The flame opened its eye. He moved fast without hurry. He set the second rag 3 steps up, then the third like notes on a line that would soon become a song. In the kitchen he slid a jar with a careless elbow and let grease kiss the floor. A second coal. A moment's wait. A longer breath. By the time he reached the back hall, smoke had begun its climb, thin at first, like a secret told by a child. He lit one last nest behind a screen near the baseboard and watched until the tiny flame found the bigger hunger waiting in the wood. He paused beneath the portrait of the old master whose gaze had followed him for 3 decades. "Count this," Samuel said softly, not as a threat but as an accounting. The old man, made of oil and lies, looked past him into a future he did not recognize. Samuel left by the same door he had used every morning since he had learned to walk fast and soft. He did not look back until he felt the heat touch the yard. When he did look, it was not to admire. It was to be sure the stair's mouth had opened wide enough that no man could close it again. He crossed the grass like a shadow. He entered his cabin without a sound. He lay beside Celia and watched the dark roof he had mended. He counted his breaths until the scream came. He did not flinch when it did. The scream cut through the night and found every ear that still believed in sleep. It rose from the second floor and slid down the stairwell like hot oil. Then came the coughing, the shouting, the pounding of hands on doors. Celia sat up. "Samuel? Fire at the big house?" he said, the words flat as a board. Outside, cold air met hot light. The sky over Thorn-field reddened as if the sun had changed its mind and come back. People ran with buckets, with blankets, with a wild hope that something wet could argue with something born for burning. Samuel took his place in the line. He lifted water from hand to hand and felt the old rhythm settle into his shoulders. The overseer dragged the line closer. The heat pushed them back like a giant's palm. Steam rose in clouds that smelled of oak and varnish and something sweet that might have been the mistress's perfume boiling in its bottle. On the east side, a window flashed. William, the elder son, appeared, hair loose, face streaked black. He fought the latch that Samuel had dressed with ash. His mouth opened on a word no one could hear. He hammered with a chair. The glass frothed. The frame held. The room behind him pulsed orange like a throat swallowing fire. The window blew outward with a sound like a shot. Heat punched the yard. William stumbled back into a room that was no longer a room. For a second, the flames wrote his shape on the wall. Then the shape vanished. At another window, the daughter clawed at a sash that stuck and then slid and then stuck again. Smoke rolled over her shoulders like a shawl she could not lift. She looked down at the yard as if someone there might know a prayer she had never been taught. The prayer did not come. The smoke did. The master moved from room to room as if the house had changed the location of its doors just to tease him. He called names like a man reading a list of debts. He banged at a door that had warped. He tried the back stair and felt only heat reach for his face. He turned again and again toward the servants' steps, as if habit could win an argument with flame. The stairs were gone. They were not stairs anymore. They were a throat of fire that wanted nothing but breath. Margaret appeared once, hair loose, nightdress gray with 1,000 tiny sparks. She lifted a hand, a lady's gesture, halfway between command and plea. Then she faded behind smoke the way a thought fades when you wake. Inside the line, Samuel's face was a mask of sweat and ash. His hands knew the bucket's path. His eyes knew how to look without telling. Now and then he let the water spill just enough to ease the fire away from the outbuildings and toward the house's heart. The overseer shouted until shouting made no sense. He called men cowards and saints in the same breath. He dragged a ladder against a wall and tried to climb into the heat like a fool. 2 field hands pulled him back by his belt with more pity than he deserved. The roof timbers caught. They glowed. They bridged themselves in red and then cracked downward with a groan that made every bone in the yard answer. The fall blasted a wind that sent skirts and hats and soles skittering. After that, the fire changed. It had been hungry, now it was full. It ate the careful corners of rooms, the silk of chair seats, the spine of every ledger, the thin gold leaf on frames that had held pictures of men who had never lifted anything heavier than a knife at supper. Someone sobbed the master's name. Someone else whispered good, then covered her mouth and looked at the ground. The line thinned. The heat told the truth. No one was coming out. The buckets, heavy a moment ago, felt foolish in the hand. People turned from saving to watching, because watching is the only thing left when the only other thing is dying. Samuel stopped counting breaths. He stared through the heat shimmer and tried to find any piece of himself inside that blaze that might still ask for mercy. He found none. What he found instead was a still pool inside him where a promise slept. He had kept it. When the last sound from inside was wood falling and the small hiss of things that go out when they melt, the yard settled into a new quiet. It was not the quiet of midnight. It was the quiet of a verdict. The overseer slumped to the ground and covered his face with his hands. Aunt Bess stood with her arms crossed and did not bow her head. Jenny held the edge of her apron in both fists and bit it until her teeth marked the cloth. Above them, the house sagged inward. The brick shoulders gave. A final beam lifted its black finger to the sky and then lay down across the place where the dining table had stood. The night went dark again because the fire had eaten even its own light. Samuel let the bucket go. It fell in the mud with a sound like the last word in a language no one should have had to learn. He turned toward the cabins. He walked slowly because there was no need to run. He went inside and sat on the edge of the bed. He put his hand over Jacob's back where the boy slept tangled in his blanket. Celia watched him for a long time and said nothing. He watched her for a longer time and said nothing back. When dawn came, it arrived like it always did, clean and cruel. Morning found Thorn-field in gray. Smoke lay low as if the night had not finished its work. The big house was a hollow, a black bowl full of memory and nails. Crows came to the chimneys that were no longer chimneys and announced themselves because that is what crows do. Men from the county arrived with hats that made them look taller. They stepped over the wreckage like boys in a creek, excited at first, then quiet as the heat reached their faces. They asked questions to fill the silence. They wrote answers that sounded like guesses. Candle? Chimney spark? Careless servant? God's will? They liked God's will best. They never asked to see proof. The overseer told his story like a man dragging a heavy trunk. He spoke of smoke, of ladders, of brave attempts and bad luck. He did not speak of stairwells that had burned like they had been waiting their whole lives for a match. The enslaved stood in small knots, murmuring. Some faces were closed against the wind. Some were open to the sun like flowers that know too much. People took turns naming the dead. The names dissolved into the air and did not return. Samuel kept his hands busy. He fetched, he carried, he nodded when a hat asked him to nod. He let his face be the face they had trained him to wear, alert, careful, full of just enough sorrow to be useful and not enough to be suspicious. When a deputy asked where he had been, Samuel answered at once. With the buckets, ask any man in the line. It was true. He had built the truth into the plan. They asked him about the bell ropes. Madam had me take them for repair, he said. He did not add that repair is a word that can mean anything when spoken slowly. They asked him about the windows. He told them what anyone could see. Old house, old frames. He shrugged with respect. They asked him about the stairs. He looked down and said nothing for a breath, as if the loss still worked in his chest. Those stairs saved many a step for many a year, he said at last. They were dry as cornmeal. Maybe it was their time. The men wrote that down. They liked sentences that made the world simple again. By noon the ashes had cooled enough for boots and excuses. The officials agreed there was no proof of a crime, only a tragedy with the sharp edges worn off by smoke. They would file papers. They would tell the judge what judges like to hear. They would go home and eat hot stew while their wives told them they were brave. But rumors do not need papers. They need only breath. By evening, someone had remembered that a boy had been sold not long ago. Someone else had said the boy belonged to the man who had always moved too quiet and thought too straight. Somebody found that story clean and neat and laid it on the table like a knife. Samuel heard the shift in the wind and braced himself. He went home early. He sat with his family while they ate. He told Ruth to keep Jacob close to Aunt Bess if soldiers came. He looked at Celia and she nodded once. That nod held a lifetime. The moon rose on a field that had read too many tragedies to be surprised anymore. The river went on moving because that is what rivers do when they refuse to belong to a single man. The boots came 2 days later, drumming the yard like rain with orders. A captain with a thin mouth set up a table in the overseer's office and spread papers the way a butcher spreads meat. He called men one by one and asked them to sit and speak into his ledger. When Samuel's turn came, he went in with his hat in his hands and his thoughts lined up like soldiers. The captain began soft. He asked about the night. He asked about the house. He asked if Samuel had ever been angry. Samuel looked at the man's pen instead of his eyes. Anger is for men who can afford it, he said. The captain wrote that down with a faint smile and then stopped smiling. They went around the fire without stepping into it. The captain had a talent for walking men into their own words. Samuel knew the tricks. He had learned them by surviving. Then James Fletcher leaned against the door and said in a careful voice, "His boy was sold last month. The smart one. The one with letters." He let the sentence hang like a noose. The captain nodded as if a puzzle piece had slid into place. He thanked the overseer with his eyes and turned back to Samuel with his voice made of ice. "Your son was sold." "Yes, sir." "And you did not mind." "I am a slave, sir. The law says what it says." The captain tapped his pen. "The law also says murder is murder." He let the word fall hard. "If a man's boy is taken, a man might light a match." Samuel folded his hands in his lap and thought of the promise to Celia. No broken faces, no last-minute rages that give men permission to call a rope justice. "A man might," he said, "if he forgot who owns the matches." The captain watched him for a long time. He did not look away. There are moments when two men see the whole story and also see that the story will not change. This was such a moment. The trial came fast because speed helps men feel clean. The judge wore black and the jury wore certainty. They liked the shape of the captain's story: a father, a sail, a fire. It fit into their heads without scraping their conscience. Evidence was thin, but motive was fat. The jury ate motive and called it proof. Samuel spoke when they told him to speak. He told the truth they would allow to be called truth. "I carried water," he said. "I worked. I slept." He did not say he had walked the halls in his mind for weeks and laid fire like a sower lays seed. The room did not deserve that kind of honesty. The verdict did not take an hour. The sentence did not take a breath. Death by hanging on Friday at noon. The square would be swept. The rope would be new. Celia was allowed to see him the night before, with Ruth and Jacob pressed against her sides like hope trying to hide. Samuel put his hands around theirs and tried to memorize every thread of their skin. He told Ruth to keep her head straight and her eyes kind but not soft. He told Jacob to grow tall for the space his brother had left. He told Celia without words that love can carry fire without burning if it knows why it burns. When they left, the cell was bigger and emptier at the same time. Samuel lay on the thin blanket and looked at the window that was too high to be a promise. He slept because he had more to do in his dreams. Morning came cold and clear. Men gathered as if for a fair. Some came to be stern. Some came to be afraid in a crowd instead of alone. Some came because they wanted to see what happens when a man refuses to be less than a man in a world that demands it. The sheriff read the sentence like a man reading a recipe. The rope swung a little, testing the air. Samuel walked to the steps and climbed. He did not stumble. The platform creaked under feet that had carried rows and rooms and years. Faces looked up at him with hunger and pity and a cold curiosity that has always followed men to the edge. The sheriff asked if he had words. Words were the only thing left they could not seize without hearing them first. Samuel looked over the crowd and then beyond them, to the line of trees that did not know his name but would remember his shadow. "I am guilty," he said, voice steady, not loud, not small. A murmur moved through the square like mice. "I killed them. I would do it again." The murmur turned into a sound with teeth. The sheriff lifted a hand and the sound broke into pieces and fell. "They took my son," Samuel said. "They called it business. They wrote it in a book and slept. I lit a fire and called it justice. I did not write it. I watched it." He looked for Celia in the crowd and found only the shape of her, because tears and distance make ghosts. He did not falter. "You can hang me," he said, "and you can hang other men. But you cannot hang the truth that lives in a father's chest. If a system builds itself on stolen breath, it will choke when a man decides to stop swallowing." He closed his eyes and saw three faces: a boy with a slate, a girl with a needle, a woman with a voice like Sunday. He felt the rope touch his neck like winter's first finger. "Do what you have to do," he told the world that had already done it. The trap dropped. The crowd gasped because people always do when gravity tells its cruel secret. The body fell and then did not belong to him. The rope took what the law demanded. The square exhaled as one, like a beast tired of holding its breath. A boy in the back turned away and did not sleep that night. A woman wiped her eyes and pretended it was the wind. The sheriff wrote his name in a ledger and underlined the date. The sun stepped past noon and did not apologize. They cut him down when the watchers had had their fill. They put him in a box with no letters on it and no one to read them if there had been. The ground accepted him the way the ground accepts everyone, without asking what he had done, without caring what men had said about it. Samuel was gone. The story was not. News travels the way rivers do, downhill and fast, quiet until it is loud. The story of Thorn-field crossed fences and counties, losing bits and gaining teeth. In the quarters, it was told in a murmur after dark. In the big houses, it was told in a sharper voice over tea. Some said the fire started with a candle left near a curtain. Some said the devil had finally found a doorstep he liked. The people who needed lies found them. The people who wanted truth did not have to look far. On a road in another state, a boy in a chain gang heard a scrap of talk from a trader who liked to brag. The boy's hands were blistered and his eyes were tired and his name belonged to someone else now. He heard, "A man set a house to burning for a son sent south," and he stopped walking for one step and let the chain pull him forward again. In a cabin 100 miles away, a mother told her child that love can be a weapon when nothing else is left. In a parlor, a mistress said mercy was dangerous because it made slaves bold. In a field, a man looked up from his hoe and felt his back go straight for a second without being told to do it. The ruins at Thorn-field stood a long time. Brick is stubborn even after the heat pulls the color from it. Vines came and wound themselves through the broken teeth of the foundation. Snakes lived where the pantry had once been. Children dared each other to climb the fallen chimney until a new owner cleared the place and built something newer and uglier on top of it. The crows kept their watch because the crows had been there before any of it and would be there after. People forgot the exact date. They forgot the names of the sons who could not break a window. They remembered the man, and the fire, and the boy sold. They remembered how it felt when a quiet face refused to stay small. The whisper never needed more than that. The world likes to say that law is justice, and sometimes it is. Often it is a map drawn by the men who own the pens. Maps mark rivers. They do not stop floods. Samuel did not start a flood. He lit one house and ended one family and paid with his body. To some, that is a crime that proves a system must be hard. To others, it is a sentence written in a language the system taught him. Pain goes where it is sent. If you ask the earth at Thorn-field what it remembers, it will tell you in roots and rust. It will tell you about a boy who learned letters in dust. It will tell you about a ledger that balanced in flame. It will say that the fire did not end in the ashes. It walked into every story told after in a low voice near a door that wouldn't close. There is a cost for every choice. Samuel counted his coins in silence and spent them all at once. The men who judged him slept that night. Celia did not. Neither did the lesson. Remember this if you must remember only one thing. A chain can hold a wrist, but it cannot hold a promise made between a father and a son. And if a house is built on promises broken, sooner or later someone will come with a match and a memory. The smoke will lift. The names will blur. The ground will take everyone back. But the truth will keep walking. It always does.